Hi, and welcome to Why Do Countries Exist, episode 47, The History of Cote d'Ivoire. So today's drink of choice is Galmakuji. Galmakuji is pretty much a type of ginger juice that is popular throughout West Africa. It's overall pretty simple. Blend up some ginger, add it to some boiling water, then strain, add some sugar, and bam, you got Galmakuji. It seems stuff like lemon and pineapple also are commonly added. I thought it was great. I love the taste and spice of ginger, so this drink was just heavenly. I put a little bit of lemon in it and everything was just perfect. It's good hot or cold. Really just an amazing drink. Now we are going to have to discuss the elephant in the room. Why not call the country the Ivory Coast? Generally, most people in the English-speaking world will just refer to it as the Ivory Coast, and media outlets tend to call the country that. However, the official name of the country, in English, is the Republic of Cote d'Ivoire. Even if the citizens of English-speaking countries call it the Ivory Coast, many other governments in official documents will use Cote d'Ivoire. The reason, based on my understanding, is the government wanted to prevent any confusion between people referring to it by its French, English, German, or any other language name. So they just wanted a uniform name all people would, theoretically, refer to the country as. So Cote d'Ivoire is located in West Africa, with Liberia and Guinea west of it, Mali and Burkina Faso north of it, Ghana east of it, and the Atlantic Ocean south of it. It generally is a tropical country, and like a lot of other countries in West Africa, the south is more foresty and wet, while the north is drier and more plains-like. Although generally Cote d'Ivoire is much wetter than places like Burkina Faso or even Benin that we've talked about before, and most of the country is made up of forest. There are about 29 million people living in Cote d'Ivoire. Ivorians are made up of many different African people groups, with some of the largest being the Akan found in the southeast, the Grous found in the northeast, and the Mandes in the west. Besides these three groups, there's some 50 other different ethnic and tribal groups. Notably, something like 1/5 of the country is made up of people who have only recently moved to the country, generally within the past century. Most are other African peoples from places like Burkina Faso, Mali, Benin, or Niger. Something like 100,000 people are non-African, mostly French, American, or Lebanese. Language-wise, most people in Cote d'Ivoire will speak their own ethnic language, with the Akan speaking an Akan language, the Grous speaking a Grou language, and the Mande speaking a Mande language. However, lingua francas are often used to bridge the language divides. Douya, a Mande language, is commonly spoken, but you'll also find French pretty common, especially in regards to education, politics, mass media, and international relations, with it being the official language of the country. Finally, religion-wise, Cote d'Ivoire has a plurality of the country as Muslim, with something like 40% being Muslim. Most Muslims are found in the north and are Sunni, although many also mix Islam with traditional African beliefs. Christians are the next largest group, most, over 30% of the country, being Catholic, with smaller groups of Protestants, Mormons, and syncretic Christian groups also present. Christians are more commonly found in the south. Finally, the rest of the country is made up of animalists practicing traditional folk religions, with smaller groups of Hindus, Baha'is, Buddhists, Jews, atheists, and other religious groups. Cote d'Ivoire, like many African countries, has a kind of difficult pre-colonial history to quickly summarize. No single tribe, people group, or kingdom ever fully or even just mostly controlled the region pre-1800s. We know by the 1000 CE, the region was connected with trans-Saharan trade networks, and Islam was slowly moving into the region. While not under the control of great Sahelian empires like Mali or Songhai, it, particularly in the north, was influenced by them. The 1700s started to see several small, centralized states spring up in the area, largely created by refugees from the north or east, fleeing instability in their home regions, with the Kong in the north being particularly powerful for a time. Starting in the 1500s, European traders slowly began establishing themselves in the area. With a name like the Ivory Coast, it's not a massive shock that ivory would be an important export from the region. However, other resources like peppers, gold, and slaves would also be sent out from the area. While initially groups like the Portuguese and the Dutch would be the main European traders in West Africa, French traders and missionaries slowly started to set up a base. Partially, this was to further their own interest, and also partially, as time went on, to prevent further English expansion from its outposts in Ghana and Sierra Leone. In the 1830s, France began colonizing Cote d'Ivoire. It at first started to sign treaties with local chiefs, setting up a protectorate in the southeastern coast, with the port city of Grand-Bassam serving as the main outpost for the French. The next 40-some years saw expansion along the coast, but the interior of the country remained free from French control. This changed in the 1880s as the Berlin Conference saw European powers carve up Africa and required active occupation of land in order for a colony to be recognized. Slowly, France began pushing north, not wanting a rival power to get there first. They came into conflict with Simon Touré, a part imam, part warlord, who was establishing a powerful empire in the Sahel and held parts of northern Cote d'Ivoire. After several years of fighting, France managed to beat Touré's armies, bringing most of Cote d'Ivoire under its control. Parts of the north, however, would remain outside French rule until 1918. Cote d'Ivoire's economy was, like many colonies, based around resource extraction. Initially, resources like ivory, wood, and rubber would be the main economic exports. However, a couple decades into French rule, the economy began to shift towards agriculture. Stuff like coffee, banana, and palm oil quickly started to grow as important drivers. However, perhaps one of the biggest drivers would be cocoa. Cocoa was found in the country before French rule, brought over from America by merchants in roughly the early 1800s. However, it wouldn't be until French colonists began investing in the crop that cocoa production began exploding in the country. Cocoa continued to be an important crop in Cote d'Ivoire, and today remains the biggest industry in the country. French rule in Cote d'Ivoire was based around its civilizing mission. This meant French culture, religion, and language was promoted to evolve the native population, with a small elite of French-educated Ivorians, known as Iolés, given greater rights. However, this was a very small and elite group, and most of the population was labeled simply as French subjects, and treated as inferior. Notably, during this time, a steady stream of people from places like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger began to move into the country. Many were forced by French labor policies that would forcibly conscript its colonial subjects, but some also began moving into the country to the promise of a steady wage, working in the many plantations that were being set up in the region. This also saw an increase in the country's Muslim population, with a religious divide starting to grow between the Muslim north and the Christian south. Cote d'Ivoire began to experience a boom after the Second World War. Political rights were expanded, plantations and timber made the colony very wealthy, which resulted in France investing more in the region, large-scale public works were built, urbanization increased, and a harbor in Abidjan, the capital of the colony since 1934, was created. Many French technicians and Syrian businessmen moved into the country, and slowly America began to eye the region more closely. Even a decent number of Ivorians became rich and moved up. Many of these Ivorians also began to grow interested in politics. Many began to align themselves with the Democratic Party of the Ivory Coast, or PDCI. The PDCI was an anti-colonial movement initially friendly with the French communists. However, it wasn't really a Marxist organization. It was opposed to colonial conservatives and wanted greater rights for Africans, but it didn't call for a class war or aligning with the Eastern Bloc. Actually, interestingly enough, many Ivorians at the time, according to Abu Bamba's book, African Miracle, African Mirage, were drawn towards America. This was both due to the wealth Americans were experiencing post-war that led many Ivorians to believe aligning with America would lead to something similar to them, along with America's founding myth of fighting against a colonial power, and that said all men were created equal, which stood in contrast to French colonial mentality, where only the civilized were equal, and even then, only on paper. The PDCI began to grow over the years, helped by its popular leader, Félix Houphouët-Boigny. Bogny came from a family of traditional African chiefs and will start off as a doctor, then plantation owner, before forming a political party/union based around representing Ivorian farmers. Bogny began to rise in strength in the 40s, being elected to French Parliament in 1945, forming the African Democratic Assembly, or RDA, which united several African movements in French Africa into a more unified force. And despite crackdowns on the PDCI/RDA, Bogny actually managed to become a minister in several French governments in the 1950s. The PDCI/RDA slowly started to both moderate, toning down some of its anti-French sentiment, and moving away from the French communists. By the 50s, it was clear the PDCI/RDA was the dominant force in Cote d'Ivoire, and Bogny as its dominant political leader. When the country was granted its independence in 1960, it's not a surprise that Bogny would emerge as its first president. Cote d'Ivoire, after independence, continued to have agriculture as its main economic driver. Coffee, cocoa, and timber would be the main drivers of the economy, but other economic ventures like sugarcane, palm oil, and very, very slowly, tourism also started to spring up. Unlike so many other African countries post-independence, the economy was actually quite good. It was so good, in fact, the period from 1950 to 1980 was dubbed the 30 Glorious Years. Foreign capital, primarily from America and France, invested heavily into the country, allowing Bogny to build up infrastructure, the first university to be created, and the Cote Dam to be constructed. Immigration into the country that started under French rule continued to increase as more and more people moved into the country looking for a better life. However, while the country's economy was growing, there was an economic disparity, as the south grew richer while the north began to stagnate. Cote d'Ivoire for over 3 decades was under Bogny and his PDCI/RDA. The PDCI/RDA was the only party allowed to operate, and similar to Mobutu's Zaire, every Ivorian was legally a member of the party. All other parties were banned, and opponents to the government were arrested or forced out of the country. This made Bogny's rule less brutal than, say, Mobutu's Zaire or Bokassa's Central African Empire, but it still was undemocratic, and power was based solely on loyalty to Bogny. Bogny was also able to use his unchecked power and heavy foreign investment to build up his hometown, Yamoussoukro, which became the capital of the country in 1983, which it remains today. Cote d'Ivoire under Bogny was also very sympathetic towards the French, Americans, and Western interests in Africa, opposing leftist leaders on the continent. Most of the technical experts in the country during Bogny's rule were actually Frenchmen and other white foreigners, much to the frustration of the educated urban Ivorians who wanted to rise up through the ranks in the country's economic and political hierarchy. Bogny, while he was for many years extremely popular, began to see discontent in the 80s. In the 70s, the economy began to slow down due to lower prices for coffee and cocoa. While the economy was diversifying, it still was mostly dominated by these agricultural products, which resulted in worsening economic conditions going into the 80s, and foreign capital started to leave the country. This was particularly devastating since Cote d'Ivoire had for many years experienced, as economist Samir Armin described, growth without development, meaning its economy had grown but without setting up the building blocks for long-term success or self-sustainability. So once foreign capital that was required to build up the economy was removed from the country, Cote d'Ivoire went from a shining star in West Africa to struggling. It was in this context that protests began to spring up against Bogny, with the largest opposition group being the Ivorian Popular Front, or FPI, headed by Laurent Gbagbo. Gbagbo's FPI was a center-left party tied to trade unions and primarily found in the south. The early 80s saw Gbagbo forced out of the country due to a government crackdown, but international pressure as the Cold War drew to a close was forced Bogny to allow opposition parties to operate and multi-party elections to take place in 1990. Bogny still won the election, allegedly due to fraud, but the FPI managed to gain some influence. Bogny would have to contend with several strikes and protests in the 90s until he passed away in 1993 due to prostate cancer. Bogny would be succeeded by Henry Konan Bedie. While Bogny did crack down on his opponents to prevent discontent, he was, even at the end of his rule, mostly popular. Bedie, on the other hand, did not have the support that Bogny was able to rely upon. He had to compete with not only opposition forces like Gbagbo, but also rivals in the PDCI/RDA, like Alassane Ouattara, Bogny's prime minister in the 90s who carried out liberal economic reforms. Ouattara, it is important to note, was a Muslim, and his parents had ties to either the north of the country or even Burkina Faso. Bedie, in order to beat back Ouattara, banned all candidates from running who weren't fully of Ivorian descent, required presidential candidates to have lived in the country continuously for the past 5 years, which banned politicians who were forced into exile, like Gbagbo, or those working abroad like Ouattara, who had a job in the IMF post-Bogny, and encouraged the idea that those with ties to places like Burkina Faso and Mali weren't 100% Ivorian. This led to both Bedie easily winning the 1995 election, but also increasing dissent in the country, as the Muslim North, which again was poorer, felt increasingly marginalized, while the Christian South began resenting many new Muslim migrants who were entering the country and changing the demographics of the country. In 1999, Bedie was overthrown in a military coup by soldiers protesting his leadership and economic downturn in the country. The military would briefly take charge until elections and protests at the results led to Gbagbo being elected. Gbagbo, fearing Ouattara's political power, upheld many of Bedie's policies that discriminated against northern Muslims, and his cabinet was made up entirely of southerners. While he attempted to rally the country around anti-French sentiment, northerners quickly became fed up, and parts of the army attempted a coup in 2001. Finally, in September 2002, violence would erupt throughout the country as rebels attempted to overthrow Gbagbo, but were pushed back by loyal army units and militias sympathetic to Gbagbo. By October, battle lines were quickly drawn, with the government holding the south and the rebels holding the north. The rebels, known as the New Forces of Cote d'Ivoire, would for the next 5 years try to overthrow the government in the First Ivorian Civil War. They were held back by French peacekeepers who attempted to create a buffer between the two warring factions, although at several points in the war, French soldiers would have to fight the government. Peace talks would drag out until 2007. A power-sharing agreement was reached with Gbagbo continuing as president, while a major rebel commander would serve as his prime minister. Laws discriminating against the North will be overturned, and elections will be held in 2010. In 2010, a presidential election was held with Gbagbo and Ouattara heading the Rally of Republicans, or RDR, facing off. After a second round, both Gbagbo and Ouattara claimed to have won the election. Protests and rioting broke out as supporters of both men took to the streets. Eventually, the battle lines were drawn up in a very similar fashion to the First Civil War, with the new forces of Cote d'Ivoire in the north and the government under Gbagbo in the south. However, unlike the last war, France didn't try to keep the two sides apart and actually encouraged and worked with Ouattara and the rebels. In March 2011, rebel forces began advancing south. By the end of April, they would take the entire country, removing Gbagbo from power and putting Ouattara as the head of the country. The two civil wars Cote d'Ivoire faced in the 2000s resulted in around 5,000 killed and almost 1 million displaced. A lot less casualties than some of the other civil wars we have talked about in Africa, but still with thousands dead, the economy and the society of the country disrupted, and a heavy toll on a lot of people. Ouattara has run the country ever since. His rule has broadly seen Cote d'Ivoire align itself with the West and embrace a broadly business-friendly economic model. While Cote d'Ivoire politically is more stable than a lot of African countries that are dealing with insurgencies or outright bans on the opposition, it still is a political system dominated and largely controlled by Ouattara and his loyalists in the RDR. While initially the RDR was allied with other right-leaning groups in the country, like the PDCI/RDA, in the late 2010s/early 2020s, many of these groups have moved away from Ouattara, citing increasing concerns about his authoritarian rule. While the PDCI/RDA and Gbagbo's allies in the FPI, or now his new party, the African People's Party, Cote d'Ivoire, are able to operate, several members of both camps are currently jailed. The opposition claims this is political persecution, while Ouattara loyalists argue most of the imprisoned were war criminals or responsible for protests/riots in the 2020s. There have been attempts at national reconciliation, and there are hopes that the wounds that were opened in the 2000s can be repaired, but tension remains present, and so long as older politicians like Ouattara, Gbagbo, and the last of Bogny's old guard continue to dominate the political landscape, it seems unlikely the wounds will fully heal. Cote d'Ivoire economically remains one of the more developed in Africa. Agriculture remains important, although tourism and oil are slowly rising industries. The cocoa industry remains king, despite concerns about child labor and low pay. What is one of the more developed and economically well-off countries in Africa, with a strong education system, it still suffers with poverty and low life expectancy. Ethnic and religious tension seems to somewhat still exist, with this being tied to political divides in the country, but you don't see the social tension in Cote d'Ivoire as you do in other places like the Central African Republic. Culturally, it is an important player in West and Francophone Africa, with Ivorian fashion, music, and cuisine being particularly notable. So why does Cote d'Ivoire exist? Cote d'Ivoire was created via French colonialism, with French influence and pressure continuing to influence the country's politics. This is perhaps not unique when looking at Africa as a whole, but it is notable how different the trajectory Cote d'Ivoire experienced after independence, with the country growing economically and remaining pretty stable, and has been spared some of the worst violence and tension other countries in Africa have had to experience. This can partially be explained by French influence in the country helping maintain the status quo, and thus keeping the country stable, but also Ivorian leaders and the people of the Cote d'Ivoire itself have chose to avoid violence and bloodshed, instead helping move the country towards the direction it is in today. So up next we will go to Croatia, prepare for the Romans, Slavs, the Catholic Church, and a lot of nationalism. So thanks for listening, thanks for watching. I apologize about the long wait in uploading this video or this episode. I've been very, very busy with work, and I just have not had time to work on the podcast at all. But yeah, I apologize about the delay, and hopefully I'll get a couple more out. If not within the coming months, at least one more by the end of the year. That's kind of how busy I am with work. But yeah, I appreciate everyone's patience and waiting for these episodes. The next episode will be Iranian political parties, then Armenian political parties, and then I will do the history of Croatia. So thanks again for listening. If you want, you can email me at whydocountries.exist@gmail.com for your thoughts, comments, suggestions, or hate mail. Take care. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. The sources I used were Abu Bamba's book, African Miracle, African Mirage, African Biographics video on Laurent Gbagbo, France 24's report on Yamoussoukro, Geography's Now video on the Ivory Coast, and Wikipedia.